Okay, and we're back with we've got two more after this, so the third to last case study. So hopefully you're still with us. So this is Townsend. I think it's Peter Townsend, I want to say. Now, this one's all about poverty. So if you've got a question about poverty or asking you anything about poverty, you're more than likely going to need to talk about Townsend. Okay, like that should be one of the first names that comes into your mind. Now, he defined three ways that we look at poverty in the UK. Now, there are two ways that he thought were not so good, and one way that he thought was really, really good. Now, in terms of revising this, okay, you need to know vaguely what the first two are about. Okay, and I'll explain those to you. But the thing that you really need to know is his preferred measure, which is the third one, relative deprivation. So I would basically prioritize. Okay, so sort of understand vaguely and be able to explain the first two, but be able to actually talk about the third measure in a bit more depth. So let's get into it. So basically the first way that he thought of how we measure poverty was the government way. So basically, you're in poverty dependent on whether you qualify for benefits. Simple as that. So basically, he said that this wasn't such a good way of measuring poverty because it depends on the government who's in power at the time. So, for example, if you've got a new right conservative government, the threshold for being in poverty is going to be really, really low because basically they don't want to give out benefit payments, so they're going to try and reduce the number of people who qualify as being in poverty. So, but whereas if you have like a Labour government or someone who are a little bit more left wing, then they're going to bring up the threshold so that they can give out more benefit payments and try and help more people. So, the way they describe it, I think it's here. So, yeah, Townsend believed this to be arbitrarily determined by the government of the day. So, arbitrarily means it's sort of like on a whim. Okay, it's sort of like it very much depends on their preference. Okay, so it's not the best way of defining poverty. The second way, though, was the relative income standard of poverty. So basically, it's whether your income is below the average income of the country. Okay, so you've got the top earners, the lowest earners, and you find an average. And if you fall below that average, you're technically in poverty. Now, he said that this wasn't so good because basically it doesn't account for things like welfare payments, so benefits. You could be on benefits, which actually technically brings up your income and takes you actually above the average. And that's not really included within that measure. And also, it doesn't consider sort of the lifestyle that you've got. So let me give you an example. So in modern times, we talk about this idea of the working poor. You might have actually heard of this on the news or something like that. Basically, the idea is that your income might be above the average. It might be decent, but you could still be in poverty. You could still be struggling. So if you have a household income of like, I don't know, 50K, okay, that's probably above the average. But if you have 5 kids, that's something that means that you're struggling. You're really struggling because that's not enough income to sustain 6, 7 people. Um, so it doesn't take that sort of thing into account, and it also doesn't take into account things like inflation and the sort of the state of the economy. So right now, for example, at the time of the video, we've got a massive crisis in terms of like things are becoming so much more expensive. Things like petrol and fuel, groceries, all because of the conflict in Ukraine, um, and people's incomes aren't going up either. Okay, household bills are going up. So technically, people are sort of earning above the average, but they're really struggling because things are so much more expensive. So that's why this particular measure isn't so good either. Okay, but let's get on to the one that he did actually think was good. So he talked about the relative deprivation method of measuring poverty. So Townsend believed that individuals, families, and groups fall into relative poverty when they lack the resources to obtain the types of diet, participate in the types of activities, and have the living conditions that are widely available to the society in which they live. So it's basically judged on whether or not you can be a functioning and happy member of society. Can you be healthy? Can you be happy? And are you living in a condition which is similar, if not the same, as everyone else. Okay, so that sort of makes the allowance far wider than any of the two previous methods. Now, he used this relative deprivation index to figure out how much poverty there actually was in the UK. So his research was based on questionnaires. He handed them out to 2,000 households and more than basically 6,000 individuals all across the UK. And he basically devised an index covering lots of different variables. So things like diet, fuel, clothing, housing conditions, working conditions, their general health, education, and sort of activities. So each household was given a score on this index, and Townsend then calculated a threshold for levels of income below which the amount of deprivation rapidly increased. So basically, he used how well people can engage in these like 60 different variables, these different activities, if you like. And if they fell below the sort of the average number of activities and sort of things they can do, they would technically be considered to be in poverty. So, on this basis, he believed that 22% of the population to be living in poverty in 1968-69. So, this compares to just over 6% that the government believed was in poverty and 9% using the other measure, relative income. So, using Townsend's method, we discovered actually there are a lot more people struggling in the UK and in poverty compared to what the government saw as being in poverty and sort of based on income as well. So he also found that manual workers, so people who work with their hands, do things, physical things, were far more likely to be in insecure employment. So they might be on 0-hour contracts, for example, experience poor working conditions, and have few work-related benefits. So the situation is worst for the manual workers who are typically working class. So Townsend's methods and conclusions have been criticised by those who argue that his index was inadequate and produced potentially misleading results. For example, the absence of fresh meat and cooked meals might not be an indicator of poverty, but of individual choice. So that was one of the categories. So, like, can you afford to have fresh meat and cooked meals every night? Like, and if someone didn't click that, sort of tick that box, they would be considered to be in poverty. When actually they might just be vegetarian. They might just not like cooked sort of warm food. There's a few holes in what Townsend came up with for this index. Okay, so there's things that weren't considered maybe correctly at the time. However, there have been lots and lots of attempts to try and replicate this study to sort of greater effect. And generally, relative deprivation is seen as one of the better ways to measure poverty. However, some also believe that it actually measures inequalities, not poverty. So it actually shows the difference between the wealthy in terms of their lifestyle and not actually sort of whether people are living in poverty. Okay, so that's sort of a little criticism that they have. Now, Townsend is important. Okay, so I would strongly encourage you to sort of create revision materials for this one. And also, if this video hasn't necessarily cleared up your question, please don't hesitate to get in contact with someone in the department. So myself, Mrs. Tuvey, Miss Estland, anyone who can sort of who does GCSE sociology should be able to give you a bit of help with this one if you need it. But hopefully this video has been useful. As I said, you are more likely to be asked about the preferred measure than these two. But I have seen people use this in both 12 markers and in 3 and 4 markers. So it is an important study to get under your belt. Okay, but that's that for Townsend. I will see you again for Charles Murray. Thank you very much.